Okay, great. So thanks for having me. I really appreciate being here. So my name is Tim Bouma. I'm a director of verification assess. Okay, are we okay? So I'm the director of verification and assessments at the CIO Strategy Council. I recently changed roles from, I was at the, with the Government of Canada. I was the senior analyst for digital identity and was responsible for doing most of the policy work, developing the federal policy on digital identity. And over the years, I got involved with developing the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework and just keeping track of the technologies, really got into decentralized identity or decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials, and kind of ingested that, brought that into the policy framework. So I want to give you a sense of what we are doing in Canada, what we're doing with the provinces and territories, and how we're evolving the policy framework to take into account decentralized identity. Going to my next slide. I want to give you a sense of the Canadian context. This is a screenshot from one of the videos that we put together about 3 years ago. We put together a video, it's about a minute long, that shows what it would look like from the end user's point of view, how they would actually use their digital wallet, how would they actually use their trusted digital identity. And I'll just read a few things from the slide. Like a trusted digital identity is an electronic equivalent of who you are as a real person that's used exclusively by you. And you use that to receive valued services, to carry out transactions with trust and confidence. Our perspective, the work that I've been doing with the federal government, we were looking at it predominantly from the point of view of providing services to the public for public sector programs. And the bottom of the slide pretty much says it all. Digital identity is the cornerstone of government online services and is part of the digital economy and is essential for security and privacy. This is a lot of messaging that we put together for our strategy documents, as well as for public communications. What's the role of government in digital identity? Again, this is one of the slides that we put together for our own internal justifications, making the case for digital identity for our senior officials. And we had identified a number of roles or objectives that we needed to attain. Number one, setting standards for what digital identity is acceptable, how is acceptable, and how to prove identity within Canada. We wanted to develop standards and best practices for digital identity. We wanted to develop an audit and certification program or certification authority. We also wanted to issue digital identity, especially we worked with the provinces and territories, also to validate attributes, and as well for federal programs to consume digital identity for government programs, and also to encourage the development of the digital identity ecosystem. We're looking at government as being like the one of the major customers of digital identity systems, and we wanted to ensure that we would encourage the industry to develop systems that we could use. And we took what we called a pan-Canadian approach. We recognized that there was no one single system. In many countries, they have a centralized or national digital identity system. But within Canada, we are a federation. We have provinces and territories, and we have multiple identity providers with the provinces. And we wanted to develop an approach that would actually work across jurisdictions. In some way, we're very similar to the European Union, which we have, the European Union has the member states, we have the provinces and territories, and the federal government is much like the European Commission, if you will. Here's another picture of Canada's digital identity vision. On the left-hand side here, we have the provinces and territories. They were building out their own systems. We had a legacy login system, which had two different systems for actually using the authentication services from the financial institutions. And then we also built our own login system called GC Key. And then we had like an overall system within the government of Canada, which we called Sign in Canada, which was the single entry point into federal programs for our employment or immigration, our passport, our taxation programs. And the vision that we had was that the government of Canada, being the federal level of government, we wanted to enable a digital identity ecosystem for the entire nation to be leveraged by all of the government departments and other jurisdictions, and to deliver services and issue digital identity to Canadians so that they could access services not only across the federal government, but with the provinces and territories as well. As we started to do this work, we saw an evolution in the technologies and architectures. Like we started, this journey many years ago. I'd say more than 15 years ago, when we had like a proprietary system that we needed to migrate off. We moved on to a standards-based system that used SAML and OpenID Connect. And generally, the approach that we had taken was to standardize our centralized systems. We had major federal programs and services that ostensibly were like centralized systems, siloed systems. But over time, we really moved into like federated systems. And then we saw the evolution into the decentralized world. And this slide is just showing the evolution between the centralized, federated, and decentralized. And we saw that evolution, and the approach that we wanted to take in developing our approach was to be technology agnostic as well as architecturally agnostic as well. One of the things that we learned when we developed our policy framework, we could actually abstract out the technical architectures and actually develop an approach that, for example, we had legacy systems with Alberta and with BC, and we came up with an approach that would enable us to actually, excuse me, adopt the newer or more modern decentralized technologies. This had been described in other presentations. We found that the issuer holder verifier model was very powerful, and it enabled us to simplify our approach. And when we developed the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, before we had many different types of roles like identity service provider, credential service provider. And we found that the issuer holder verifier model was a very powerful model that enabled us to normalize our roles. And then of course you have the verifiable data registry as well. So over the past 4 or 5 years, we've been developing what we've been calling the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework. It's really a policy framework where we actually developed and formalized some of the newer definitions. And we built out a modular framework, if you will, where we developed what we call a normative core, a set of standards, terms, and definitions that we developed. And we defined what we called identity domains, like foundational identity versus what we called contextual identity. Foundational identity is something that the provinces and territories are responsible for. Like when you're born, there's a vital statistics event. There's a registry that records your birth or your immigration. In the case of federal immigration, we call that foundational identity. We also formalize what we call digital representations of persons, organizations, and relationships, We formalized a whole series of what we call atomic and compound processes. One of the things that we discovered was that many of the identity management programs that were out there had evolved from like legacy programs like driver licensing, immigration, passport. They had their own nomenclature, their own naming, their own business processes. They all had different names. But what we did was that we took a hard look at all these business processes and decomposed them and defined what we called atomic processes. So we could actually standardize how we actually analyze and assess them. We also formalize what we call dependencies. As we said, we discovered these programs for digital identity or trusted digital identity had evolved over time, and they would either have dependencies on the health systems, the driver's licensing system, insurance systems, and we just formally defined what dependencies were so we could actually understand the program before we assessed it. And then we formalized a whole series of conformance criteria, requirements or assessment requirements or conformity assessment requirements, along with qualifiers like levels of assurance, for example. We also began to define what we called a mutual recognition process. How do we actually formally recognize like a trusted digital identity program from a province or a territory? This was exceptionally important for like federal government programs because we wanted to have confidence in the integrity of the program before we formally accepted it into the federal systems, if you will. So we had an approach for doing mapping processes. We started to look at aligning to other frameworks. We recognized that not only did we have to have this mutual recognition process for domestic or for the provinces and territories, we also needed to started to take into account how would we actually accept perhaps like trusted digital identities from the European Union or from the United States or from other countries. We developed like a formal assessment process, and then we had what we called an acceptance process where we had an internal governance process to sign off on the accepting of trusted digital identities. And then we also recognized that trusted digital identities did not exist within a vacuum. There was what we called a supporting infrastructure, technologies and systems that were provided by the private sector that would be used. And then we also defined what we call digital ecosystem and information roles. A lot of the stuff that we developed over the past number of years evolved not only because of the newer technologies or the newer approaches, but as we collectively understood our own application of the framework, we iterated and brought this into the trust framework. So at the end of the day, what we developed, and this is you can find out on the GitHub repo, we developed like a consolidated overview, a very extensive document that documented all of the concepts that I described earlier. We combined the scope of not only persons and organizations and relationships, we defined a whole series of atomic processes. And we also added in a lot of background information, high-level guidance. We also, when we developed the conformance criteria or the conformity assessment criteria, we brought it into like what we called an assessment worksheet, which was used to do the assessment with the provinces and territories. And basically this was the engine, if you will, that enabled us to actually go through and assess a program. And then finally, it's similar to like issuing a certificate, a conformity assessment certificate. We had a formal process where we actually documented the assessment process and did a formal a letter of acceptance that was issued by the Government of Canada, our Chief Information Officer, to the province or to the territory. And this has been an iterative process. We've gone through the process 4 times. We've done the province of BC. We did an initial assessment and then a subsequent assessment. Same with the province of Alberta. We did 2 assessments and we've iterated. We've gone through, I think, 4 versions of the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework. What we learned is, you know, first of all, what is a trusted digital identity? What exactly we're trusting? It's one thing to talk about these things conceptually, but when you get down to like the specifics and we're relating this to policy, you know, we had to formally define these things. And this is where it starts tying into decentralized identities and verifiable credentials, which are really an implementation or technical implementation of actually what we're accepting. So here we have the idea, a formal term of trusted digital identity. It's an electronic representation of a person used exclusively by that same person to receive values, services, and to carry out transactions with trust and confidence. Really what that is from a verifiable credential point of view, we wanted to enable an individual to present who they were, a proof of who they were, to get immediate access to federal programs. What we learned was that we only needed a very minimal set of attributes for a trusted digital identity: a unique identifier, a surname, a date of birth, and an insurance level. And we made sure that the definitions that we had were independent of the technical integration protocols. So it's supported by SAML, OpenID Connect. We have implementations with 2 provinces. And once the decentralized identifiers or with the W3C and the verifiable credential protocols, we'll be able to technically integrate that as well. So, you know, we actually have some formal definitions of the data elements here. I won't go into that detail. So at the end of the day, what are we trusting exactly? We're trusting that a province or territory is dealing with a real person, that it is the same person when accessing a Government of Canada service using their trusted digital identity that's issued by the province or territory. This goes into a little bit more detail again. We have a whole series of Treasury Board policy requirements from the federal point of view. We have the Directive on Identity Management with very specific requirements. We have the standard on identity credential assurance. We have an assurance level assessment tool. And when we wrote the letter of acceptance based on our assessment, we formally went through and enumerated how it met all of our policy requirements in terms of identity assurance, credential assurance, our notice and consent. And then what we did, we also, when we did the detailed assessment of the program, and we found what we called observations, we found things that we would take note. I wouldn't call them non-conformity or conformity gaps, but they were things that we noted that we raised, documented, and made sure that the Government of Canada CIO was aware of these things. And we also highlighted a bunch of potential risks and issues. And again, this was all facilitated by that assessment worksheet where we went through all of the criteria, we formally assessed it and documented it to issue this letter of acceptance. The detailed assessment process, it would take us, if we were doing a province from the first time around, it would take about 6 months in terms of duration, not necessarily effort, because we would have an initial engagement process where we brought together the team. We'd have a kickoff there. If possible, we would have a site visit. That wasn't really possible with the pandemic. We would go through a detailed program mapping where we actually would map the program to our understanding of the atomic processes. We would gather evidence to analysis, and it was an iterative process. Then we'd go through the formal assessment of the program, and then finally finalize the what we call the letter of acceptance and the approval process. And this just gives you a sense of the detailed assessment process. And again, a little bit more detail. When we did the assessment, we would gather the evidence, we would tabulate the evidence. There would be an iterative process here. And once we've got that, we would actually then do the formal assessment, and then we'd have feedback. There would be an iterative process here. And then finally, we'd draft the letter of acceptance and refine it along the way. What we're doing now is taking all the work that we're doing and developing a national standard. We've actually issued, or the CIO Strategy Council has issued, a standard on digital trust and identity. And we are now taking the work that we've done with the public sector profile, the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, and we're actually turning it into a formal conformity assessment scheme that's going to be accredited by our Standards Council of Canada, or National Standards Organization. So we're taking all the work that we've been doing over the years and actually formalizing it into a national standard and developing the formal conformity assessment schemes. And this is just another picture of the standard that's being developed. The interesting challenge within Canada, we have not only federal legislation, I like to call it the legislative stack. We have legislation, policies, directives, standards, our guidelines and technical standards, but our jurisdictions, the provinces and territories, have the same thing for their own particular jurisdictions. So the challenge is that there's no single legislation across the country. And we use the trust framework, the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, to actually help us to develop those standardized definitions. We use the national standard here to actually formalize the assessment process. And then within each jurisdiction, they would determine how to put it into effect against their own policies and legislation. The standards development process is a bit of an eye chart here, but there's a formal standards development process that's in place for developing national standards. And that's about it. That's all I have for my presentation. I know it's gone fairly quickly. There's probably lots of questions around like decentralized identifiers and how this plays into the work that we're doing in Canada. I'll just stop sharing my screen here and just to open it up for any questions that people might have.
Thanks, Tim. I'll start with the question. And you've already sort of suggested it. You mentioned the implementations of SAML and OIDC and others, W3VC, and then you mentioned, I think, waiting for the standard to be ratified. Is that the current position within Canada, or is there something else?
Yeah, one of the things we're working on right now, like for like SAML and OpenID Connect, those are well mature standards. Like and we have like technical profiles that we developed and have been that we've been using them for years. The challenge is with the decentralized identifiers and the verifiable credentials, or that whole space. I think we've identified like about 5 or 6 competing technical stacks, if you will. Like there's Aries, there's sorry, it's late at night, so I can't remember them all, but the whole ecosystem is actually still fairly dynamic, and we don't know how the market is going to play out. And the approach that we've taken is that we've said, yeah, we like the idea of the decentralized identifiers. We like the idea of the verifiable credentials. We like the model of issuer holder verifier. And we are in the process of developing a digital credential, what we're calling a technical specification, that's formalizing requirements around that model, but not getting into the specific technologies. It's still wide open in terms of like, what are the formats? What are the technologies that are going to win? And even less certain are the apps or the digital wallets that the ecosystem or what the users are going to going to be using. It's still such a new area, and just being very, very careful to make sure that we maintain our optionality in the space. Like, there's also the mobile driver's license that's happening. There are some interesting efforts that are doing what I like to call verifiable PDFs. There's and again, you've got the W3C, but you also have stuff that's in the passport realm, like the digital travel credential. So it's a pretty sort of noisy space, and I think it's probably going to take a few iterations before the ecosystem will land on one or two or three different technical schemes. I don't know if that's answering your question or not.
Yeah, I think it does, and I think also I recognize as you drew the diagram of the kind of federated provinces of Canada and the national kind of a model. That's a very similar challenge to Australia, where each state has its own set of laws and rights, and there is a federal government as well. So we have the same complexity.
Yep. Yeah, the trick here is that it's not going to be big bang to decentralize identifiers. These ecosystems, these technical ecosystems, are going to coexist for some time to come, perhaps forever. So the work that we did on the policy side and with the trust framework, we recognize that the traditional centralized or silo-based kind of architectures, the federated architectures, and now the decentralized, they're going to coexist. There's going to be hybrid architectures. There's going to be multiple systems that will have to interact or interoperate. And so we have to account for these different technical architectures coexisting and interoperating.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments or?
I've got another if you like. I know that Benny's sort of lining up the next talker, but to my surprise, because I thought I was on top of what was happening on the 18th of February, so what, 4 days ago, the Digital Government Exchange, which is an initiative I didn't even know existed, amongst 8 countries, which is Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Finland, the Netherlands, the UK, announced a set of policies on digital identity interoperability. Any comment from you on that, Tim? Was that something you were part of?
Yeah, that's the DGX. And when I was at Treasury Board, that was a working group that popped up about a year ago or so. And, it's a pretty busy, there's all these different working groups that are asking for your time. We've been doing work with the Digital Nations, which is yet another group that was working on some projects as well. And then the DGX, I wasn't involved directly. My colleague was, I think, at a couple of the working group meetings. So frankly, I was a bit surprised too to see this paper pop out as well. And, it's good. But I have to loop back with my former colleagues to see how much input they had on this. Mm-hmm. Typically what happens with a lot of these papers, you'll get one country or whatever really driving it. And I think it was Australia that was really driving this paper. That was the impression that I got.
It was chaired. I think each working group has a different chair, presumably from the 8. And I think Australia, yes, chaired that particular working group. And the DTA, the Digital Transformation Agency in Australia, chaired it, which is the owner of our TDIF, our Trusted Digital Identity Framework. What was surprising to me in that report, and I'll make reference in the panel we're talking later, is that there is one paragraph of reference to, in fact, there's several references to SSI in a positive vein in that report, somewhat to my surprise, because of the existing infrastructure that most of these countries have. But it's an interesting report to read between the lines.
Yeah, I just skimmed through it. I haven't really given it a deep read, but I know that we've always been very, very supportive of SSI. One of the other projects that I was leading when I was at the federal government, and I probably should have put some more slides on that, was the user-centric verifiable digital credential challenge, which we had 6 vendors do these like innovation projects where they experimented with different approaches to SSI, and we had different use cases for security clearance. There was one for like digital birth certificates, etc. And this was about a year ago, a little over a year ago, and we were experimenting with these different approaches. And there's a GitHub repo there that I can actually share that, or have Benny share that later on. And that's kind of where we learned that these technologies were still very much in the formative stages, but very promising on like the results of that project. And so we've been very bullish on SSI, or verifiable credentials, or decentralized identity. So it doesn't surprise me that that positive attitude got into the report. The thing that we learned was that from an institutional perspective or a policy perspective, you can be fairly neutral on the technical architectures. I think if you kind of double down on the issuer holder verifier model, you can actually work that back into the traditional architectures. You just kind of have to rethink things. And then it really becomes an issue of what technologies you're going to build out. And I think there's going to be some, what I would say, fragmentation, ecosystem fragmentation, probably over the next while, until like all those technologies get sorted out and standardized.
Yeah. I'm just sharing a link to the rest of the people in the chat to the document I just referenced. So excuse my distraction.
Yep.
That's it. Otherwise, I'll end up talking to you about cycling, Tim. So
it's a dead of winter here right now, so I haven't been out on the roads.
Well, you're unlucky. I have been. It's the glorious part of the end, towards the end of summer here. Good time.
Tim, there's a question in chat from Mohammed.
Oh, okay, let me just see here if I can see it. I'm curious to know how the personal data protection regulations were touched on in developing the trust framework and the assessment. Sure. So the work that we did on the trust framework, we made sure that we did not like repeat or make redundant work that was done on what we call privacy impact assessments, which is really that's what we call it in Canada, the privacy impact assessments, not personal data protection, and also security. And there were service delivery requirements. So in fact, when we did the assessment and the onboarding into the federal programs, we basically, there was the PCTF assessment, which is really around the integrity of the program, making sure we can actually trust the issuers, if you will. But then there was another stream that looked at the privacy aspect. There was another stream that looked at the security aspect. There was another one that looked at the service delivery aspect. So we kept the trust framework really focused on program integrity, if you will, and the existing frameworks around privacy, security, service delivery, they were applied as well. So we really made sure that the tools and the framework didn't repeat work that had already been done. Hopefully that answers the question. Yeah, that's one of the traps that you can fall into with in developing these assessment frameworks, is that you kind of stray into other areas. And as I said, it was all about program integrity. How do you actually are confident that you're actually getting that real person, and it's that real person that's presenting themselves. Are you there? Are you there? Or who do I hand the reins over to?
There's one more question in chat.
Oh, okay. Let me see here. Oh, okay. How did you handle key management and interoperability in PCTF when you know these are something yet to be figured out in terms of technology? Yeah, okay. So that's one of the things that we're finding out now. There's really two aspects that you need to look at. One is what I would call the program management side, which is all about the integrity. Is the program being managed? Is it, you know, these are more like business requirements, if you will. And then there's the whole technical integration part, which is then you're getting into all the key management and interoperability and the data specifications. So I was really focused on the management layer, if you will, and not into the technical integration. We had technical folks that were responsible for the integration. Again, for SAML and OpenID Connect, it was not really a big issue. And we haven't yet actually implemented like a decentralized identity solution yet that the government is using, and that's where that will get sorted out. And frankly, I think there's just a lot of issues there that we just haven't started to figure out yet. Okay. Well, how about we leave it at that? And I'll hand it over to